Some stories are so old that their echoes seem woven into the very fabric of our faith. And yet, even among the most familiar accounts, there are hidden corners waiting to be explored. Today, we're going to open one of those corners together. The story of Adam and Eve's true children, a narrative tucked inside the first scroll of Genesis, layered with meaning that has shaped the destiny of humanity. You've probably heard the names Cain and Abel since childhood, two brothers whose tragic rivalry ended in bloodshed. Perhaps you know about Seth, born after Abel's death, carrying forward a promise of hope. But did you know the Bible hints at many other sons and daughters? These unnamed children, so briefly mentioned, have fascinated scholars and believers for generations. Why did Scripture choose to record some names in detail, while leaving others shrouded in mystery? What can we learn from this selectivity, and how does it speak to God's plan for His people? When we open Genesis, we're not just reading ancient history. We're stepping into the origin story of every one of us. The very first family was more than the first parents. They were the beginning of all nations, cultures, and faith traditions. Their choices, their faith, and their failures still ripple through our own stories today. And understanding who their children really were helps us grasp the depth of God's grace and the seriousness of humanity's fall. As we journey through these verses, I want you to picture the scenes unfolding, the quiet moments after Eden's gates closed, the hush of a world newly tainted by sin, the first cries of children born into a life outside perfection. Imagine the questions that must have weighed on Adam and Eve's hearts. What would become of their sons and daughters? Could God's blessing still find them in the wilderness? This exploration isn't just about curiosity. It's about faith. It's about understanding where we came from, so we can better know where we're going. And it's about finding reassurance that even from the earliest days, God was working out a plan of redemption, hidden in plain sight among genealogies and simple verses. So let's walk together back to the beginning, past the flaming sword and the guarded gate, into the story of the true children of Adam and Eve, names known and unknown, who shaped the course of humanity in ways more profound than we often realize. Number 1, the garden, a place of origins and secrets. Before we can understand the lives of Adam and Eve's children, we have to step back into Eden itself. Imagine a place so perfect that every breath was a reminder of God's goodness. The Garden of Eden wasn't just a paradise, it was a place of purpose. In Genesis, we read that God planted this garden and placed the man He had formed right in the middle of it. Every tree that was pleasant to the sight and good for food grew there, including the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But tucked inside this beauty was a command, one boundary, one test of love and obedience. Do not eat from the tree in the center. It's easy to think of this as a simple rule, but it was so much more. It was a choice that would determine the future of all humanity, including the generations yet unborn. When Adam and Eve fell, sin didn't just stain their own hearts, it infected everything that would come from them. Every child born afterward carried that loss. And yet, even before God pronounced the curse, He spoke a promise that the seed of the woman would one day crush the serpent's head. This is why Eden is more than just a place of failure. It is a place of prophecy. Hidden in the descriptions of Genesis are hints that God already saw beyond the fall. The very fact that Adam named his wife Eve, meaning the mother of all living, shows he still had hope. It was an act of faith in the face of despair, and that hope would carry into the lives of their children, those who were born outside the gates, but not outside the reach of God. As we think about the children of Adam and Eve, remember this. They were the first to inherit both the gift of life and the weight of sin. They were the ones who first had to learn how to build a life east of Eden, to find purpose in a world that no longer reflected the perfection their parents once knew. Even their names and stories carry the echoes of that tension, a struggle between judgment and grace that still defines the human experience. Number 2, the first family, Cain, Abel, and Seth. When Genesis begins to name the children of Adam and Eve, It does so with an almost startling simplicity. Now Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain. That's it. A short sentence marking the arrival of the first human ever born. And what a burden he carried. Eve herself proclaimed, "I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord," as if to say, here is the fulfillment of the promise. Maybe she thought Cain would be the one to defeat the serpent. Then came Abel. No fanfare, no prophecy, just another son. But God saw something in Abel's heart that he did not see in Cain's. While both brought offerings, Abel's was accepted because it was offered in faith, and with the best he had. Cain's was rejected, and from that moment, jealousy bloomed into the first murder. It's easy to see this as just a tragic story of sibling rivalry, but it's deeper than that. It's the first evidence that humanity's hearts were already divided. One son chose faith, the other chose pride. One sacrifice pleased God, the others brought wrath. Their story sets the tone for every generation afterward. A struggle between worship and rebellion. After Abel's death and Cain's banishment, the Bible records that Eve bore another son named Seth, but notice how differently he is described. God has appointed for me another offspring instead of Abel, for Cain killed him. Seth wasn't just another child, he was a sign that God's promise hadn't ended. Through Seth's line, people would eventually call upon the name of the Lord again. Even in this first family, you can see how God began to separate those who would seek him from those who would turn away. This division didn't happen in a single moment. It unfolded across generations. But it began here, in the lives of three brothers whose destinies diverged so completely. When we read about Cain, Abel, and Seth, we're not just learning history. We're seeing the first outlines of a truth that still shapes us. Our choices matter. What we offer to God matters. And even in the aftermath of sin, God's purpose moves forward, often through the most unlikely paths. Number 3, beyond the names, the forgotten sons and daughters. When people think about Adam and Eve's children, most stop with Cain, Abel, and Seth. But Genesis offers a tantalizing clue that the family was far larger than these three. In Genesis 5:4 it says, "The days of Adam after he fathered Seth were 800 years, and he had other sons and daughters." Just imagine that. Centuries of life, countless births, generations, springing up long before there were nations, cities, or written histories. It's easy to wonder why Scripture didn't record all their names and stories. Were their lives less important? Did they simply fade into obscurity? Or did God choose to highlight only those lines that were crucial to his redemptive plan? While we don't have all the details, this single verse is a reminder that God's purposes are bigger than any record we can compile. Some early Jewish writings and ancient traditions speculate about these unnamed children. According to some traditions, Cain married a sister. Others suggest whole clans grew from Adam and Eve's unnamed daughters, spreading across the early world. While we must be cautious about speculation, these ideas point to something profound. The first family was the fountainhead of all humanity, and their descendants filled the earth as God commanded. There's something humbling in realizing that most of those lives, hundreds, maybe thousands of them, are known only to God. They lived, worked, married, and died without ever being written into the main story. Yet without them, none of us would be here. Their silence in the text doesn't mean they were insignificant. It means God chose to focus our attention on the spiritual line that would lead to redemption. For believers, this is a powerful lesson. Our names may never appear in history books. Our deeds may never be praised by crowds. But that doesn't mean we're unseen. God knows every life, every choice, every sacrifice. In his eyes, no story is too small to matter. And the fact that Genesis acknowledges these sons and daughters, if only in a brief sentence, shows us that God's plans include even those whose stories are hidden from view. Number 4, the mark in the exile. Cain's legacy. After Cain killed Abel, God confronted him with a question that still echoes through human conscience. Where is Abel, your brother? Cain's bitter reply, "Am I my brother's keeper?" reveals a heart hardened by pride and defiance. Yet even in his judgment, God showed mercy. Instead of taking Cain's life, he marked him with a sign of protection, saying that anyone who killed him would suffer vengeance sevenfold. The mark of Cain has fascinated scholars, artists, and theologians for millennia. What was it? Was it a physical sign, a change in appearance, or simply a divine guarantee that Cain would not be hunted down? Scripture doesn't say, but the meaning is clear. Even in exile, Cain was not beyond God's notice. He became a living warning and a living testimony to God's unwillingness to abandon his creatures completely. After his banishment, Cain went east of Eden to the land of Nod. There he built a city and named it after his son Enoch. In this detail we see the beginning of civilization, agriculture, cities, the arts. All of these have roots in the line of a man defined by rebellion. Genesis 4 lists the descendants of Cain, including Jabal, the father of those who dwell in tents and have livestock, and Jubal, the father of all those who play the lyre and pipe. Even Tubal Cain, the forger of bronze and iron tools, came from this family. What does this teach us? That human progress does not always align with spiritual faithfulness. Cain's descendants were innovators and builders, but their legacy eventually led to more violence and corruption, culminating in Lamech's boast of murder. While the line of Seth was calling upon the Lord, the line of Cain was establishing a culture without him. This contrast matters because it shows that humanity's story is not merely about survival or achievement. It's about worship and obedience. The cities Cain's family built were impressive, but they could not erase the stain of sin. They remind us that no amount of progress can fill the void left by a heart turned away from God. As we consider the legacy of Cain, we're confronted with a sobering truth. It's possible to be marked by God's protection and still live a life estranged from his presence. But even then, his grace was evident, giving Cain time, space, and descendants, a chance, however faint, to turn back. Number 5. Seth's line, a lineage of promise. While Cain's story spiraled deeper into darkness, Seth's story began with a glimmer of redemption. When Eve gave birth to Seth, she declared, "God has appointed for me another offspring instead of Abel, for Cain killed him." This wasn't just the relief of a grieving mother. It was a sign that God's promise had not been cut off by tragedy. Seth grew up in the shadow of his older brother's legacy. He would have heard the stories of Eden, the shame of the exile, the horror of Abel's death, and the sorrow that hung over his parents. But instead of bitterness or rebellion, Seth's line produced something new: faith. Genesis tells us that it was in the days of Enosh, Seth's son, that people began to call upon the name of the Lord. This phrase is powerful. It means that in Seth's family, there was a return to worship, a public declaration that even in a broken world, God was still worthy of devotion. It was the first revival, the first communal turning of hearts toward their Creator. While the descendants of Cain were building cities and forging tools, the descendants of Seth were building an altar of faith. The genealogy in Genesis 5 traces this line carefully, from Adam to Seth to Enosh, and eventually to Noah. This lineage is not preserved merely for historical curiosity. It shows the unfolding of God's redemptive plan. Each generation carried forward a fragile hope that one day, the promised offspring would appear. The names in Seth's line, Enosh, Kenan, Mahalalel, Jared, Enoch, Methuselah, Lamech, and finally Noah, are not just a list. They are a testament to God's faithfulness across centuries. Enoch, in particular, stands out because he walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. His life was so pleasing to the Lord that he never experienced death, a glimpse of the restoration that would one day come through Christ. When we reflect on Seth's descendants, we see the quiet power of faith, passed down through generations. They weren't perfect. They still lived in a fallen world, but they chose to call upon God's name. and that choice shaped the destiny of humanity. Their story encourages us to remember that faithfulness in our own families, however small it may seem, has the power to echo long after we are gone. Number 6. The mysterious sons of God and the daughters of men. As the generations multiplied, Genesis records one of the most puzzling passages in all of Scripture. When man began to multiply on the face of the land and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. This strange union produced the Nephilim, mighty men who became legendary in the ancient world. Scholars and theologians have debated this passage for centuries. Who were the sons of God? Some believe they were the descendants of Seth, while the daughters of men were the descendants of Cain, interpreting this as a breakdown of the godly line marrying into the ungodly. Others see them as angelic beings, fallen angels who crossed a line God never intended, introducing a corruption that would hasten judgment. While we may never have every detail, this story highlights something critical: humanity's increasing departure from God's design. Whether through spiritual compromise or supernatural rebellion, the world was becoming so corrupted that God declared, "My spirit shall not abide in man forever." The mention of the Nephilim adds to the mystery. These giants were men of renown, famous for their strength and power, but fame does not equal righteousness. The rise of these figures showed that humanity's heart was focused on earthly greatness, not heavenly devotion. This moment sets the stage for the flood. It shows how far the children of Adam and Eve had drifted. What began with a simple act of disobedience in Eden had grown into widespread violence, immorality, and spiritual decay. Yet even in this dark chapter, God preserved a remnant, Noah and his family, descendants of Seth, who found favor in the eyes of the Lord. The lesson here is sobering. When God's people forget their calling and blend themselves with the values of a corrupt world, the result is not progress but judgment. But for those who hold fast to faith, like Noah, there is still grace. Number 7. The message for today: why lineage still matters. As we look back over the generations that came from Adam and Eve, it's easy to wonder how any of this ancient history applies to our lives now. After all, thousands of years have passed since those first families walked the earth. We live in a world of technology, nations, and cultures that Adam and Eve could never have imagined. But even across all that time, their story still matters, because it reveals the truth about where we come from and who we are meant to be. The lineage of Adam and Eve teaches us that God cares about generations. He doesn't see our lives in isolation. He sees how each decision, each act of faith or rebellion, ripples forward into the future. Cain's choices set a pattern of violence and pride that echoed through his descendants. Seth's choice to seek God laid the foundation for the line that would eventually lead to Christ. The unnamed sons and daughters remind us that even when our names aren't recorded, our lives still matter in God's plan. This perspective challenges the way we think about legacy. In our culture, legacy often means wealth, fame, or accomplishments. But in God's eyes, the truest legacy is faith. The most important thing we pass down is not our reputation, but our devotion to Him. Understanding this story also helps us grasp the seriousness of sin. The fall in Eden was not a myth or a metaphor. It was the moment when humanity turned away from God. Every generation since has felt the consequences, but woven through that sorrow is the promise of redemption. Even in the genealogy of Genesis, you can see hints of God's plan to rescue His people. The promise to Eve that her offspring would crush the serpent's head, the preservation of a faithful line through Seth, the salvation of Noah's family. For believers today, this is more than history, it's hope. If God could bring redemption out of the wreckage of Eden, He can redeem our families too. If He could sustain a faithful remnant through generations of violence and corruption, He can sustain us in a world that still drifts from Him. So when you read these genealogies, don't skim past them. See them as a reminder that your story is part of something much bigger. You are connected by faith to a line that stretches all the way back to the first family. and forward to the day when Christ will return to make all things new. For real. Conclusion. As we close this exploration of the true children of Adam and Eve, I hope you feel a sense of wonder at the depth of God's story. These early chapters of Genesis are more than ancient records. They are the foundation of everything we believe about sin, grace, judgment, and redemption. Think about how God's purpose never wavered, even when humanity stumbled again and again. From Eden to the flood, from Cain's exile to Seth's worship, he was always working to fulfill his promise. That same God is still at work in your life today. No matter how far you feel from Eden, no matter how broken your story might seem, his grace is still reaching for you. So let these accounts inspire you to look deeper into Scripture, to see your faith, not as a private matter, but as part of a lineage of people who chose to call upon the name of the Lord, to remember that every act of faithfulness, however small, echoes into eternity. And above all, to trust that the God who kept his promise to Adam and Eve will keep his promise to you. One day he will restore all that was lost. The gates of Eden will open again, and those who belong to Christ will walk once more in the presence of God. Until then, may we live as children of that promise, marked not by the stain of sin, but by the hope of redemption.